Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. In today's video I'm going to talk about Azure Active Directory, or specifically Azure AD Connect. Bear in mind that this video is not going to cover how to install Azure Active Directory on how to synchronize Azure Active Directory, because as you know, there are hundreds of videos out there in YouTube and any other website that we can find that they talk deeply about how we can configure Azure Active Directory or synchronize identities from on-premise network to an Azure Active Directory environment. But instead, this video is going to be a conceptual video that we will talk about how Azure Active Directory will work, or even why we need to synchronize identities from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory environment. This video is going to talk a little about this synchronization just because we need to understand a little of it, and I'm planning to create another video specifically on how synchronization will happen and what are the elements of synchronization service and how everything under the hoods connect to each other in order to synchronize identities from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory environment. But this video is going to only talk about Azure Active Directory Connect and why even synchronization is important for us in this technology era. So stay with me. Before moving into understanding of synchronization and Azure AD Connect, we need to know that Azure AD Connect that we are working today is not something completely new, and it is an evolution of the other application and software that's being used by Microsoft users for some years. Back in then, there was a tool called Identity Integration Server 2003, and this one a bit old. I wasn't working in IT field that day, but I suppose this was the first time that the concept of synchronizing identities came into play. And after that, this solution kind of evolved to another solution which was called Identity Lifecycle Manager. An Identity Lifecycle Manager was kind of identity integration server with more features. But this was not the end, and this Identity Lifecycle Manager again evolved to another product, and it was Forefront Identity Manager 2010 R2. Forefront Identity Manager 2010 R2 was the time that I started working with synchronization service, and it was the first time that I touched synchronization servers. And this Forefront Identity Manager 2010 R2 basically the fundamental of another product which is called Microsoft Identity Manager 2016. And now these days we're using Azure Active Directory Connect, and the synchronization service that relies in Azure AD Connect is kind of the same that's been using in Forefront Identity Manager 2010 R2. This is quite the same with a couple of differences, but the conceptual tool and feature behind the synchronization service is exactly the same. So if you have already worked with Forefront Identity Manager or Microsoft Identity Manager, you will understand that once you're working with Azure AD Connect, there are so many similarities between these two. So this is going to be somehow easy for you to understand the synchronization. But as we said, this video is not going to cover completely synchronization. I'm planning to have another video dedicated to understanding of synchronization service, but again, this one will not talk deeply about synchronization servers. In order to understand Azure AD Connect, we need to understand synchronization, and once we found out how synchronization works, we will be able to understand what is the benefit of Azure Active Directory or Azure AD Connect. In order to understand all these, let's use an example for that. let's say that we have an environment which is an Active Directory domain, as you can see in the left, and also we do have an environment of Azure Cloud. This is going to be an environment that we already purchased from Microsoft, and we're going to use that Azure Active Directory in order to synchronize identities from on-premise environment, which is in the left, to Azure Cloud, which is in the right. When we're talking about Active Directory domain, of course, we're going to have domain controllers. And also, we're going to have a server. And this server is going to use in order to synchronize identities from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory or Azure Cloud. This server is called Azure AD Connect. This is the connector that we use in order to synchronize identities, as we said. Of course, when we say identities, one of the identities that we really need to synchronize to Azure Active Directory environment is going to be the user account. The user account relies in Active Directory, and these user accounts have different attributes. They can have different managers, they can have same account name, they have office phones, they have email address, and everything that you can think of. But they also have the credential, and these credentials are going to be their password or long-term key. And we discussed about these keys in Kerber's video. So what we want to do is to synchronize these identities from this domain controller or this domain to Azure Active Directory, which is in the cloud. And for that, we're going to use the server that you can see, as we called it Azure Active Directory Connect. And of course, between these two environments is going to be heavy firewalls, and nobody can touch any other thing, and no inbound connections to domain controllers and things like that. So they are completely two separated environments. Within an Active Directory, there can be so many user accounts. Depending on the size of the environment, this number can be from 10 user accounts, or it can go up to hundreds and thousands of user accounts. But this is really clear that you do not want to synchronize all the identities which is inside the Active Directory domain to Azure Active Directory. But instead, you may need to select a couple of users, or select the selection and have a subset of users that they will get synchronized to Azure Active Directory. The very first thing that we can do in order to synchronize and have a filter in our synchronization is going to define a filter and define a scope of synchronization. And this scope is happened by using a source OU or source container that we define in order to fetch the user accounts that are inside that container. Let's say that when we have 6 user accounts, as we can see in the picture, if we select just a source, like only the users who are residing in Medsys OU, so the users who only are in this OU will get synchronized. So the other user will get filtered out, and only a selection of users will get selected in order to synchronize to Azure Active Directory environment. In order to start synchronization process, we need to start working with Azure AD Connect, which means this server is going to be able to synchronize identities. For that to work, this server will need a credential or a connector that connect the server into the Active Directory domain in order to be able to fetch the user account. This is called a connector. The name stands exactly what it does. It connects the Azure AD Connect server to the environment, and using that connector, the server will be able to fetch the user accounts. So this is called connector, as we said. But there will also be another container, and this container is kind of attached to the database of Azure AD Connect server. And this container will have all the objects that we select to get synchronized to Azure Active Directory. This container is called connector space. And within that connector space, basically, we keep all the object that is going to get synchronized to Azure Active Directory, which means that all the objects that we have already selected and passed the filter, they will get an image into this connector space, into this container. And we need to know that these objects are not the real objects. They are just some image of the real objects. And these objects are called image or holograms. And the process that we use in order to synchronize the identities for the first time to the container of the connector space is called import. And basically this is the process that we do in order to synchronize the user from our connected data source to connector space. This is going to call import. But this is not the end. As we said that Azure AD Connect do use the SQL server, and within the SQL server it has another container. This container will also get used in order to complete the synchronization. The synchronization will not get completed unless all the objects from connected data source get synchronized to the database of Azure AD Connect. Just don't forget that all the connector space and all the other containers that we use in order to synchronize are residing in the database of Azure AD Connect. But in the video, I'm kind of separating them each other in order to understand what's going on. So the identities from connector space, they will synchronize to the intermediate database. And this intermediate database will need to be covered in another video because there will be so much processing involved within this database. This database is called Metaverse. And this is exactly the same Metaverse that we had in Forefront Identity Manager or Microsoft Identity Manager. And they are exactly the same. There's no difference between them. They do this, they use the same concept. So within the Metaverse, Azure AD Connect keeps all the objects that are coming from different connected data source. It can be an Active Directory environment, it can be a SQL Server environment. In Forefront Identity Manager 2010 and Microsoft Identity Manager 2016, there are more connector data source that are supported in order to synchronize identities. But as we said that this concept of Metaverse needs completely a different and separated video in order to understand what's going on. I will create another video about the Metaverse and synchronization. But for the moment, you need to keep in mind that the users from on-premise environment will get synchronized to the connector space, and once they are in connector space, they will get synchronized to the Metaverse. And once they're in the Metaverse, the users again need to be synchronized to Azure Active Directory. But again, they will not simply synchronize from the Metaverse to Azure AD Connect. Instead, Azure AD Connect needs a connector space for the Azure Active Directory. And in order for this server to be able to synchronize the identities which is inside the Metaverse to this cloud, to this connected data source, it needs to have a connector space for Azure Active Directory. And once we say that there is a connector space for Azure Active Directory, of course there's going to be a connector for that. And using this connector, the identities from Metaverse can get synchronized to the connector space. And you can see the different connector space because the one which is blue is the connector space of the Azure, and the one in the left is the connector space for on-premise environment. Basically, this is necessary for object to get synchronized to connector space from Metaverse in order to be able to export it from the connector space. And the final step in order to complete the synchronization process from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory is to synchronize the identities which are in connector space to real Azure Active Directory. And in this process, all the objects from connector space, which are marked for synchronization or output synchronization, will get synchronized to Azure Active Directory cloud. And at the end, all the objects that we have selected and we have marked them for synchronization will get synchronized from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory environment. So we're going to have two sources of identities in two different places. But what we even need this kind of thing? Why? Why this is really important for us to have these identities in two different environments? Let's, for the moment, forget about the server, Azure AD Connect and the metaverse and connector space and everything like that. In order to understand why synchronization to Azure Active Directory Connect can help us, we need to give another example. Let's say in our Active Directory environment, we do have a web server, and using that web server, client will be able to navigate to a website in order to, read information about the organization and things like that. For that to happen, if we want to allow a specific set of user account to be able to read the website, we can use the source of the user account which is inside the domain. And in that case, the source of the Active Directory domain will be completely reliable for that. Which means that if someone wants to connect to this website by using a specific user, the authentication will pass by the Active Directory inside the on-premise environment. But what happens if the users who wants to connect to the web server are not inside the on-premise environment? They are connecting from their home, they're connecting from internet. And in that case, let's say that the web server is not inside the Active Directory domain. So this is also outside of the domain. What we do want to have a specific set of users that we have defined in our Active Directory to have access to that website. If we want to allow these users to be able to log into that web server by using their own credentials in Active Directory, of course, the user will need to be able to contact the domain controller in order to receive a ticket, in order to get authenticated by Active Directory to log into that website. Of course, we can have anonymous logons and things like that, but let's say that we want to get authenticated by domain controller and we need someone authoritative to validate our credential. If that's the case, the user needs to contact the domain controller. But of course, this is not going to be possible because all the domain controllers inside the environment are heavily protected by firewalls. So once the client reaches there, the request will be rejected. Even you can't simply reach the domain controller, you can't even pass the border, the packet will be dropped. So this is not going to be a really effective solution, and the process will be failed. Another solution was to establish a VPN connection so that the users can connect to on-premise environment and get authenticated using that VPN. And in that case, the user will need to have a connection to connect to on-premise environment. But this is not again the case, because we don't want to allow someone to connect through the VPN. We just need them to get authenticated by an authoritative source of authentication, and we don't want to give them access to all the infrastructure and all the basically we don't even want to let them in using VPN. So again, this is not going to be so much practical. And now let's focus back to Azure Active Directory environment. As we said that by using Azure Active Directory and synchronization of user accounts and identities from on-premise environment to Azure Active Directory, we can have two sources of identities in two different places. So the one will be an on-premise environment and the second will be an Azure. By using Azure, because it is in the cloud of the Microsoft, we can simply connect to that pool of identities and get authenticated. And at the end, we will get authenticated by a reliable source of authentication And that source of authentication will lead us to the website that we were requesting for. So in Azure Active Directory, this authentication is completely different. The protocols are completely different. Authentication in Azure Active Directory using different type of authentication and protocol methods. It can be OpenID, it can be SAML and things like that. But when we are getting authenticated inside an on-premise environment, this is completely different. We're using NTLM or Kerberos in order to get authenticated by domain controller directly in on-premise environment. And of course, there's going to be other benefits of using Azure Active Directory. So for example, once the identities are getting synchronized to Azure AD Connect, we have much more availability. And since all the identities are hosted in Azure data centers, they have much more availability. And we are sure that we're going to have a high number of SLAs. In this video, I try to explain in an easy way why Azure Active Directory can help us in solving the problems of authentication that we're facing today. And I try to explain a little about the synchronization and how synchronization can happen. But I will explain deeply the concept of synchronization in another video, because the concept of synchronization is going to be completely different and needs specific and separated videos. So I will create another video specifically in order to understanding of synchronization, which is being used in different tools like Microsoft Identity Manager and Forefront Identity Manager. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time.